That one sounds a little bit better, I think. It has like an echo.
It does have an echo.
Is there an audio person in here?
Is this one better?
No, now that.
Oh, here we go.
It's such a small room, if you just project.
I can project. I am loud.
Yeah.
You're good.
All right. Do you guys want us on the mic or not?
Audio technician here towards
Okay. Sounds good. How about now? Good. Are we good? I can do that testing
Yeah, that's
thing that
better.
we're never supposed to do. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Shay Rhodes, and I am the director and the co-founder of the Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation at Villanova University's Charles Widger School of Law. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation with our amazing panelists this afternoon. And I think that we are the most popular panel, so yay. Thanks for coming. And we only have an hour, and I could take up that entire hour with all of the questions that I want to ask just Dr. Henderson. But, and so maybe we need to have a future symposium where we spend a day just talking about data and the different kinds of research that we can be doing. But I am hopeful that we will leave some time at the end of this hour, towards the end of the hour, for all of you to ask questions. And I also know that Angie is going to be at a table. Are you doing a table?
Yeah.
Okay, round table. Maybe you can, if you don't get to ask your question here, maybe you can just follow her to her table discussion. So I know that when it comes to changing laws, which means either repealing laws, fine-tuning, creating new laws, legislators and policymakers look to data to support the argument on why that change is necessary. And using data, specifically data that is empirically driven and methodologically sound to back up the need to change our laws and policies is key. I teach human trafficking to law students in the fall semester every academic year at Villanova. And one of the key articles that I assign for reading is by my co-founder of the CSE Institute and has her PhD in philosophy from Oxford, Professor Michelle Madden-Dempsey. I teach this article, which is entitled, "What Counts as Trafficking for Sexual Exploitation? How Legal Methods Can Improve Empirical Research." And I think it's critical when we're looking at research that's claiming to establish either prevalence of human trafficking, that it's really important that we look to the legal definition. What does the law say? And this can be really confusing because it's also like just the definitions from state to state to state change. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act has a different definition. The Palermo Protocol has a more robust definition. So which definition is being used? And then it causes problems with researchers who don't take into account or do take into account and then discount some of the facts that meet out that legal definition of trafficking, right? So if you're looking, case by case and a researcher makes the decision that because someone consented, that it falls outside the scope of the legal definition of trafficking, which we all know is not true, and therefore the research might not be correct. And what I'm hopeful today is that this panel is going to set some light for all of us on why data is critical for advocacy and law reform, how that data is gathered can help us determine whether it can be relied on or whether we need to criticize it, think critically. And these amazing panelists are here to demystify all of this, right? I could introduce all of them. Again, we only have 1 hour. That would take the entire hour, but immediately to my left is Dr. Angie Henderson, a professor of sociology and the executive director of the Social Research Lab at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado. Ian Hassel had co-founded the network in 2013 after 10 years of working in the intelligence community. And Taina, I mean, she's Taina, we all know Taina.
One now. Share.
She's amazing, and her 3 decades of experience is really going to inform a lot of us today, and she's currently the executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. And if you don't know Taina, after today's panel, you should definitely take the time to get to know her. Dr. Henderson, I'm going to start with you. What is data? How do you gather it? How do you use it? And what do you expect the rest of us to do with it?
That's a lot of questions. It's a poorly worded survey question, actually.
It's a compound question.
And this is why data scientists and researchers have problems with lawyers. No, I'm kidding. So that's a great question. And instead of talking about what data is, which should be, data is a representation of the facts, or it should be, right? How people use data is where we can get into trouble. Data should be used to form opinions. Good data, right? Data that is gathered ethically, it's reliable, it's valid. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of what that means because I think we all know. But essentially, if it's reliable, we can ask that question again, and it's a similar population, we'll get the same answers. Do the study again, get similar answers. Validity is, are you actually getting the truth, right? And I think, and I'm the theory professor in our department, so I teach the theory classes and have for 17 years. And I think data without theory is problematic. And the reason I say that is we need to be able to understand what we're looking at. So when we talk to somebody who's engaged in the sex trade and they say, this is empowering, this is great, I love this, it's just like any other job, I deserve to be paid. We have to take into account theory, right? A colleague that Shay introduced me to, Dr. Selena Gallo-Cruz, she's at Syracuse, she's wonderful. She's currently working on a research project talking about liberatory consciousness, right? And so it's this theoretical idea that you don't really understand what's happening to you until you're removed from that oppression. Then you become liberated in a way that you can look back at that experience and go, oh my God, that's what that was. So we can gather data from people involved in the sex trade, but we also have to be able to theoretically understand and explain their answers, why those answers are occurring, and then what do we do with that information? So I'm hoping that answered your question, and I'm hoping that people, what do I expect you all to do with it? What do I expect attorneys to do with it? People who are advocating for policy, use it responsibly. Be able to talk about it in a way that you understand how the data was collected, or you can at least point to the source. I was listening to the podcast that Yasmin was on last week, and the woman opposing Yasmin saying, is it okay to pay for sex? Yasmin said no, and the woman opposing, her name is Caitlin. I paused it. I had to sit down. I was getting on the plane listening in my AirPods, and I was like, I need to sit down and write down everything, because I know there's a study that she's missing, making that point. I know that there's also a study that she's missing, making this point, she being Caitlin, not Yasmin. And so it drives me bananas as a scientist, as a social science researcher, when people say that things are true, but they have no data to back it up and no theoretical understanding of why that data is showing up in a study the way that it is. So, use it responsibly. Data 101.
And someone's opinion is not data.
No.
Right.
It's valid, right? Sure. But it's not, it needs to be based on data.
That's key. Ian, I'm gonna also ask you a compound question. But I'm gonna tee it up for you first. You have been successful in working with states' attorneys general across the country and furtherance of your mission, the network's mission, to eradicate the illicit massage industry by simultaneously deploying several tactics, including the landlord engagement program. So my questions to you are, how did you choose the illicit massage industry to focus on? How did you determine that the problem exists in a particular jurisdiction? How do you determine if the disruption tactics that you're deploying work? And then finally, how do you determine if the disruption does in fact lead to eradication?
Okay, this is the sort of iffy one.
Okay. Luck, data, data, and data.
Wow.
That's
And
simple.
moving on, no smart mouth. Look, you're just a smart mouth. Do I need to break it down and go slower?
No, I got it.
Okay.
So when we launched the network in 2013, it was really just a unfunded nonprofit with a bunch of big questions. That's all we were. And our questions were, is trafficking organized? If it's organized, can we map that organization? Can we get inside it and figure out how it works? And if we can do that, can we do something to it to break it, to make it not work? That was it. That was kind of like our idea. And we took a team of volunteers. I used to work at the CIA. My co-founder worked in the Army's Special Operations Unit called Delta Force. That is totally irrelevant as it applies to trafficking. That doesn't in any way give me cred. That's just the truth of my background. So in our sort of counterterrorism thinking, we're like, well, let's go find the people involved and watch what they do. And so we actually split up into 3 teams in New Orleans, Louisiana in 2013. We had a team looking at some Russian-owned strip clubs down on Bourbon Street. We had a team looking at a really popular escort site in New Orleans. We had a team sitting outside of an illicit massage business. And day one, doing surveillance, watching what was happening. You see the pattern of middle-aged, mostly white men come in, stay for 28 to 32 minutes and leave. Okay, that's a pattern of a sex buyer. And then we saw that first day, older guy, Asian male, arrived and he went inside, but he left in under 5 minutes. And when you're doing surveillance, as you all know, there's in pattern and out of pattern, and that was out of pattern. So we're like, oh, let's follow that guy. So we follow him, and he goes to another illicit massage business. He does the same thing, in, out, under 5 minutes. And we're like, oh, okay, interesting. So we kept following him. We went to another one and another one. And this guy was mapping the network for us. We didn't know what he was doing at that time yet. He was a facilitator, a courier, was he moving money, drugs, we didn't know. But that's why my answer is luck, because we just stumbled on it. And that was over 10 years ago, and we are still working on the illicit massage industry. I forgot your other 3 questions, but I'm not going to answer them anyway.
It's fine, I'm here, I can do this. All right, I can ask you them again. The second question is, how do you determine, okay, so you just told us luck is how you stumbled upon this in New Orleans.
Yeah.
You're working across the country. So let's pretend you want to come to my city, Philly. How do you determine if the illicit massage industry is a problem in Philadelphia?
Oh, right. Yeah, that was all my other answers were data.
Okay. I mean, I know it's a problem, I live downtown, so, but how do you do it?
Yeah, so we made a big investment, really. I mean, 4 years ago, we started staffing a team of data scientists, software engineers, really smart people who automated the scraping of websites that are popular among sex buyers in this segment of trafficking. Illicit massage is just one of the verticals. It's one business model among many different business models. We focus on this one. And we scrape sex buyer review sites and advertisement sites and combine all that data together to kind of weed out what's highly likely an illicit massage business versus what is, not or suspect. And we take that data then, we marry it with the landlord name and address, which is also publicly available data, and we bring that to an attorney general, and we ask the AG to mail a simple letter to the landlord saying, hey, you've got a tenant, they're operating clearly a commercial sex brothel based on this online content. That's a violation of your lease. That's also a violation of some state laws. How can I help? That's it. There's no investigation, no prosecution. We're not collecting evidence. The first time we did that in 2021, Wait, I'm not gonna tell you. How many places do you, okay, so we started in Missouri. What percentage of those storefronts disappeared after the letters went out? What do you think? All of them. Oh, I love the confidence in this one.
We know this, we know this.
2%.
2?
Yeah.
Did I get a 2%?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, it's
Okay.
a reality.
Anybody else?
Some of them don't want to leave.
60%. It was 55%. The AG did a press conference. He said 55% of the storefronts went away just by mailing out those letters. And so we're like watching the
Where'd they
data
go?
every month. And we see the numbers come down.
Right.
And then here's what was kind of interesting.
They didn't
The numbers didn't like just come right back up. Because you would think somebody gets evicted, they're just going to relocate to a different strip mall, right? It didn't happen. I can't actually say why it didn't happen, but it was very curious. So we thought, well, let's test that data. Like, let's run it again. So we've actually done that 19 more times in either a state or a large county. And every single time we've had a closure rate between 50% and 100%. That was only in Mesa, the city of Mesa, Arizona, where they actually had 100% eradication. I should probably stop there, but that's just.
No, I have one more question.
Okay,
So you've answered them all very well. You so far got an A.
thank you.
The 55% closure rate, and then you're saying it's not ticking right back up. But when do you go back to see if this landlord engagement program, this particular disruption tactic that you're using, is leading to eradication? Because that's what your mission is.
Right.
Not just to shut 55%, but eradicate it.
Yeah, so I would call that tactic, like landlord engagement is what we call it. It's like a tactic. It's one tool in the toolbox to get rid of illicit massage businesses. We would say it's good, not great. And there's two big reasons why. One is if we ran it nationwide tomorrow, we would still have 50% of the problem left. There's, by the way, like as of last month, about 14,800 illicit massage businesses in the United States. That's barely less than the number of Starbucks in the United States. It's like a really, really big problem. If we ran it nationwide, we'd still have like 7,000 storefronts. That's not eradication. The second good, not great, is we don't yet have an answer to like, so where did the women go in the place?
Online.
I'm like, we're not okay with that. I'm completely not satisfied with that answer. It's not something our organization is kind of built to address, but we just launched this year a partnership with Catherine Chon at OTIP, the Health and Human Services. She's starting to bring together panels of survivors from this type of trafficking to see if we can come up with solutions to communicate and understand where those women go. What we do know is that, like, today, when those storefronts exist, what's happening inside right now is rape, it's violence, it's robbery, it's torture. These places are not happy ending massage parlors. Like, that is such a lie. And so if we're making some progress, we're very proud of that.
Have you looked at your local online stuff and seen if any of those statistics went up? Because if they left the storefront, they went somewhere. So have your online traffic stuff went up any? Because I can almost bet you it has.
We don't actually have the ability to measure that yet, but
Okay.
I think you're right. That might be where some of it goes. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. It's a start, and it's pretty cool, so thank you. Now, Taina, you are a cutting-edge leader in this movement, and you've been really on the forefront of the equality model advocacy in New York. And I routinely am asked, well, what is the equality model in the US? And I consistently refer people to the New Yorkers for the equality model website, which is fantastic and filled with so many resources and data. I also know that Angie, in her capacity as the executive director of the Social Research Lab, did a study for all of you called Impunity, Ignorance, and Racism in the Sex Trade, a multi-method study in New York State. And, you know, in that study, which I have read, it had two overarching findings. First, that sex buyers in New York are operating with impunity, and that they are openly perpetuating a racist ideology. Have you been able to use this study and all of the other data that you have gathered in New York in your advocacy, and how has it been received by legislators in New York?
Well, thanks for having me, and I have a very high threshold to cross here. So just want to tell everybody, I've been doing this forever, so I don't have all the answers. I'm just, when I listen to Ian's work, it's just extraordinary what this group of, are you all men in this group? Oh, wow, okay, so the assumptions we make. And this is what our government should be doing, and they're not doing it. And I could, explain why they're not doing it. So in terms of the data, yes, we work with Angie to receive data. We ourselves issued a report on sex buyers in New York State. As you know, the equality model really focuses on the ban of sex purchase, and it is extremely difficult to persuade legislators, society, our district attorneys, with all due respect to a phenomenal lady in the audience, Michelle, that sex buyers actually do harm, and that they are major perpetrators, that the majority of the survivors with whom, if not all of the survivors, we work with and have walked with throughout the years, have said that sex buyers have been by far much more violent than their pimps or traffickers.
Yep.
And so I think the narrative that is really helpful for us, and of course data is critical, but data is very difficult to reach or to get, is the types of harm that sex buyers do and that they are perpetrators. Mind you, in every state of the country, including in Nevada, it's a crime to patronize. But somehow in our cultural imagination, these are just boys who want to have fun, what's the harm? I had the Manhattan District Attorney's Office look me in the eye, look us, because we were on the Zoom, and there were survivors on the Zoom really giving extreme detail as to what sex buyers had done to them. And then at the end of our conversation said, I don't see the harm.
Right.
Like, I can't see black and brown men go to jail. And it's like, you don't have to put black and brown sex buyers in jail. There are plenty of white sex buyers in the target. So, having data is obviously, I'm not an academic, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher, so we really count a lot on whatever data we can get, and it's like throwing spaghetti on the wall, I have to say. It's just very, very difficult to persuade. This is the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is primarily a legal advocacy organization, but this is not a legal issue anymore. I mean, it is, but we have good laws. They're not fantastic laws, but we have strong enough laws to address patronizing and offering survivors the services they need. But it's a cultural battle. And how do you address the cultural battle, right? It's about storytelling, but if you don't believe the story, then what you have to figure out, like what doors through which you have to constantly go through to persuade the people in power and the people who have the ability and the resources to recognize male violence against women in all its forms, whether or not money was exchanged for it or not, to deal with the situation. I did want to talk about sort of from a 30,000 bird's eye view kind of situation, is that our federal law, our trafficking law, is not conducive to finding out like what is trafficking, not what is trafficking, but like conducting data. So with all due respect to our wonderful Trafficking in Persons Ambassador, Cindy Dyer, who said yesterday that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act resembles the Palermo Protocol. It does not. We do not meet the international standards of the definition of human trafficking. And we don't know or remember that that the definition of trafficking under the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and its reauthorizations is really bifurcated.
Right.
So I'm sure everybody, I mean, I don't know, but most people in this room, and certainly in the media, and even our federal agencies and our state agencies and politicians, defined trafficking as, well, it's the definition of the severe forms of trafficking, right? So a prosecutor has to prove force, fraud, coercion. We all know in this room that if you have to prove force in cases of trafficking, you're never going to find the trafficker.
Right.
It is very, very difficult to establish force, fraud, or coercion in trafficking because the force happened, maybe it never happened, right? Maybe it happened the first 24 hours, and then 6 months later, when the police raid the solicit massage parlor or a brothel or a strip club, it's like there's no force, there was no gun to her head, there was no lock on the door. How are you going to prove force? But there is the definition of sex trafficking in the TVPA reflects more or less the Palermo Protocol, which means that it's anyone who induces and entices, procures, transports, obtains, patronizes, and solicits another person. So those three little words, and this is thanks to the 2015 Justice for Victims Trafficking Act, proves that sex buyers are part of the trafficking spectrum, right? They are active actors within the trafficking process. But nobody ever talks about that because it's not the criminal provision of the severe forms of trafficking on which we are operating. So how can you conduct data when you have to prove force, right? Because I was recently speaking to a Homeland Security agent in New York who raided an underground strip club. There were 12, 13, 14-year-olds, mostly black and brown girls across Manhattan. And one of the agents said, well, there was a 16-year-old, but she told me she was a sex worker, so I left her alone. And you just think if our feds
Right.
have that mentality, how much education can we give? And then just one last point is the research that we need is on prostitution, not necessarily trafficking. Because of the way our laws are built, it would be very difficult to have comprehensive, accurate data on trafficking. I mean, at the UN level, UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes, is the guardian of the Palermo Protocol. And like the Trafficking in Persons report, every year they produce a report on trafficking around the world. The operative word they use is detected victims of trafficking, because it's whatever data that each government gives them that they can spit back out in reports, but there's not one single government that knows how many people are trafficked in their countries, because again, when you go back to culture, it's the sex trade is one of our harmful cultural practices, and so because it's so normalized and mainstreamed and glamorized in Hollywood and elsewhere, these are crimes that are hidden in plain sight. And so until we figure out that prostitution is male violence against women and feminized bodies, and that we have to analyze it and look at it the way we did domestic violence, sexual violence, tuberculosis, female genital mutilation. Unless we actually know what the harms are and we have scientific data to do that, we're going to be having these conversations for many years to come.
Thank you for that. And to your point, my institute puts out a report on the state of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation in Pennsylvania every spring. And we look at both the human trafficking data, the prostitution arrests, and the sex buying arrests. We have to look at it all comprehensively. It's so critical. Thank you for reminding all of us of that. So in my work, and on a daily basis, if not multiple times per day, I get an email or a phone call or a text message where someone is asking me how I respond to those who advocate for either full decriminalization of the sex trade or legalization of the sex trade when they claim that and I'm gonna read this so I don't get it wrong, because I've written this down so many times. Where the Nordic model, or equality model, has been implemented, people who sell sex are made more vulnerable, and violence against persons in prostitution increases. I wrote persons in prostitution, they say sex workers, but you get the gist. Or, when they claim to have decades of data that proves that decriminalizing the entire sex trade reduces violence and STIs, in addition to people in prostitution can come forward and successfully report and hold accountable those who abuse them. I'm asked this constantly. How do you all respond? Because I know you're also asked these questions. Yes, Dr. Henderson, go first.
Just like when I was listening to the podcast that Yasmin was on a week or so ago, I sat down and took a lot of notes and made note of all of the studies that I'm aware of that refute the claims that the pro-sex work site was saying. I'm not sure if that's just what nerds do. Anybody else sit down and do that? Yeah, other professors, yeah, right. Because I know that data exists. So there were times when she would make claims saying exactly what Shay just said, and I'm like, nope. In countries where it's been legalized, trafficking increases. In Amsterdam, one of the most famous places, right, for sex buying, sex trafficking. We know that domestic violence rates have gone up, harassment in the workplace has gone up, sexual assault in the workplace has gone up.
Yep.
It's been 24 years. Do you think they would have figured out how to protect people who were involved in the sex trade by now?
Right.
24 years is a long time, actually. So I know that there's research out there that completely refutes those claims. And so when I hear somebody on a podcast say, you know, X, Y, or Z, we know that this is happening, I ask myself, who else is making those statements? Who else is making those claims that sex work is empowering? Pimps and traffickers. So data exists for a reason, and you have to be able to use your theoretical lens to tie together those statements to be able to say, this is straight out of the mouths of people who are already exploiting. The other thing I say is, and there was a point in the podcast episode, Yasmin was in here, where the opposer, Caitlin, had said something like, well, she kept referring to the sex trade as any other sector of any other labor, right? And so we always hear this argument that it's just like any other job, and it should be treated as such. And what I say is, and this is highlighted in the report that I did for Taina and the New Yorkers for the Equality Model, which I brought several copies of, 15, because I didn't think this room would be packed. So if you guys want a copy of it, I'm happy to give it to you before you leave. But she talks about it as though it's any other job, and that it's great and empowering. I'm sure the CEO of a diamond company or of a jewelry company would say, yeah, things are great here. I'm not exploited. Well, what do you think the people who are being exploited on the ground are gonna say, right? When we talk about privilege, privilege is not the majority, not in capitalist countries, not in capitalist global society. So people, yeah, I'm sure it's been great for this individual who wasn't involved in the sex trade. Fine, great. Your voice represents your voice. It is valid. It is not reliable. Meaning, it's not going to be replicated among people who are at the very bottom, people who have no other choice. Great, you have a choice to leave. And she did leave, and now she has a successful podcast. That voice does not represent the many at all, not even close, right? So I tend to point out where the privilege lies in the sex trade. When I teach, I always talk about how social institutions that exist in our society are merely microcosms of larger society. What that means is, if I'm teaching sociology of sport, which is a very fun class to teach, the inequality that we see at the societal level is only replicated and sometimes made worse in some of these social institutions. Do we see racism in sport? Yes. Sexism in sport? Yes. Homophobia? Yes. All of it. The sex trade is the only one where those differences and that inequality is so easy to see, yet we are so tempted and do ignore it. And it's called empowerment. Racism in any other social institution is not called empowering, but it is in the sex trade. It's mind-boggling to me. So I give them journal articles to read, and then I ask, hey, do you want to talk about this over coffee? Nobody's ever taken me up on it. I know you would.
I would have coffee with you. Taina, how do you answer those questions?
Yeah, well, Angie covered a lot of it. How do I answer these questions? Gosh, every day you have to answer these questions. It's a follow the money situation. It's always a follow the money situation, and you will always find the money behind it. There's a lot of manipulation of data, disinformation, misinformation, and I'll give you a case in New York. What happens is they find the most vulnerable spokespeople to call for decriminalization of pimping in New York, in particular, Black and brown trans women whose testimonies you hear, and they were sex trafficked as children, they were left for dead, sodomized, stabbed, and you think, and you want that for the future generations of vulnerable children. So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. But, you know, when we talk about follow the money, so many of us in this room know that there was this pro-prostitution group, one of the first ones in the United States, called Coyote, which was founded in San Francisco, and it was co-founded by a convicted pimp named Margot St. James and Priscilla Alexander, who also claimed to have been in prostitution in some form or another, but then became an academic, and then went on to the World Health Organization, which also formed UNAIDS during the AIDS crisis, and that's when the whole quote-unquote sex work ideology started, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, in a nutshell. So there was the World Whores Congress in Amsterdam in 1985, where the term sex work, quote unquote, was coined, as well as sex positivity. Those were the two terms. The people know about the first, they don't know about the second, which has had enormous negative implications in our society, particularly among adolescent girls and young girls. What is sex positivity? And the damage that ensued. And so from there, it just trickles, right? So if you look at all of the studies that have refuted the equality model laws in France, in Sweden, in Ireland, you just follow the data, and it's all linked to the sex trade. So ugly mugs in Ireland is formed by a convicted pimp. It was a convicted pimp based on his own acknowledgement that inspired Amnesty International to draft their resolution calling on member states to decriminalize the sex trade. In Australia, which is also a federalized country, in that just like the United States, prostitution is governed at a state level or a province level, unlike most European countries where prostitution is federalized. Fiona Patton started the Sex Party, and then she thought, well, maybe let's not be that obvious, change the name of her party, is still currently a member of parliament. She was the sponsor of the decriminalization bill in Victoria, Australia. Her life partner is the largest pornographer of Australia. So obviously it takes a very long time when we do have these debates to say, well, you know, you're pimp inspired and pimp funded, so, or you use data and then totally manipulate it.
Misuse.
Yeah, misuse data. So it is very, very complicated and laborious. And again, going back to culture, when I first started, you know, the whole terminology fight was really it was just us. There were 10 on one side and 10 on the other, and we kind of fought amongst each other. And now there's not one media outlet in the United States that does not use the term quote unquote sex work. And what does that do when, how do you bring that back? It's very, very hard to bring it back, I think. That's why we need the survivors.
Your turn. How do you answer those questions?
One word only.
Not nearly as well as these two, first of all. Great answers. And I love the history, by the way. It's so good. So important to remember. I don't have anything to add to that. I think the only other thing I think about, because I'm a man, is like there's no debate in our country about whether I have the right to choose what I do with my body. Like, that's not a thing. Like, men are not, we don't need to go, like, march on the mall and say, it's my body, it's my choice, right? I think the only other thing I think about is, like, the patriarchy. Like, that is so baked in. Until, I think it's like 1972, you couldn't get a credit card in the United States without your husband's signature on an application form. Like, that is insane. But I think
That's how old I am.
that, I think there is a component of that, the full decrim kind of nonsense that's like sort of rooted in the a patriarchal thinking about like, we can have a debate over whether buying someone else's body should be a form of work in the same way that, like, you know, Target sells commodities off the shelves. And I think it's like, I'm actually not totally there, I'm still like working this through, but I think that there's like some sort of like objectification of women's bodies that is like assumed in part of that conversation that doesn't ever happen with me. As a man, I don't have to worry about those debates.
You can help me with that.
So before I get to my concluding question, because I want to wrap up with that for everyone, I know y'all have questions, right? So now it's your turn. Ask them. I will stand up and hand you the microphone. I work in a law school and I teach law students, and I am perfectly happy to go and just call on you.
That's my only question.
Yeah.
For those of us working in the nonprofits, what are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves as we continue to work with survivors? As you said, similarly, we are an unfunded nonprofit with lots of big questions, but we're kind of trying to figure out how to bring the data for our case. I'm curious how you both would, what advice you might give us.
It's a great question. It's a really great question.
Okay, here's my like stump speech on data. Like, focus leads to measurement, measurement leads to like outcomes. You can actually assess outcomes once you can measure, and outcome leads to funding. And I think like that's not fair to kind of make it that simple, but I do think that like where nonprofits struggle, they think it's funding, and it is, like, that's a real thing. I would say it's a little bit further upstream. I would say it's more about, have you clearly defined the problem you're trying to solve, focus? Have you measured it? Like, can you say how big the pie is? Like, because you need to know how big the problem is that you're working on, the specific one that you're working on. None of us are working on ending trafficking or exploitation any more than anyone solving poverty or hunger.
Right.
Like, those are just, it's too big to even like talk about. So like, focus, measure the thing you're focused on, test outcomes. With your data, you'll be able to say like, oh, this makes the problem smaller or bigger. Or, I mean, the number of things that we've tried that don't work, like, that's a whole other session. But I think that like funding follows that kind of chain of like focus, measure.
So optimistic. He's a white man.
Angie just won. Angie won. I'm gonna walk to the back. You have a question?
I have a question for the network, and I'm a little nervous about it because I'm not trying to be confrontational. But I went to a presentation in LA, and I heard law enforcement laugh about some of the survivors running out the back door. Their main focus was just to shut down massage parlors. And I'm from New Mexico. We have more per capita, according to the network, than any other state in the country. And I feel like there's an issue with, I know you have to work with law enforcement and the AG's office to get those letters to be taken seriously. I think it's a great idea. But the reluctance to work with survivors to help those people who are running out the back door.
Right.
And that didn't seem to be something that they were really very considerate of. didn't seem trauma-informed, which it isn't, of course, but I'm just wondering, like, what kind of steps you're taking to kind of address that?
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's super important. I'm sad to hear that you had that experience. Part of our like screening when we're thinking about working with a partner is like talking about how do they view victims. We don't work with partners that would arrest victims, for example. We just decline to work with them. But it's this could be again like a really long answer. I'm trying to like distill it for us. The women that are in exploitation today in illicit massage businesses, their primary felt need is work. Most of them entered the United States for work. They wanted to make money. And so crafting solutions for them kind of has to come from that start point. One of our close partners is Restore NYC, which is an amazing service provider organization that serves many Asian victims of trafficking. And we have about 40 more organizations. We sort of have them broken up regionally around the United States. So, Omaha doesn't have anything, but what's nearby in the region, so we can connect survivors to services when we have the opportunity to interact with them. And we hired a survivor of trafficking and illicit massage to work on our team to help us think through those exact questions. I don't think we've fully addressed it. I appreciate being asked in front of my team who's here because it matters to them as well. And I think that's just something that we need to continue to be asked about.
Hi, thanks for that. I would say I'm also very sorry that you experienced that, but I work for an advocacy organization. I can tell you the government is not our friend.
Right.
They are just not. And the majority, if not all, of the women who find themselves in the sex trade, especially from abroad, come under serious cases of debt bondage, which is a violation of human rights and U.S. law. They have histories of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual abuse of children, rape, you name it. They did not come here for work. They came here because a third party exploited, abused that vulnerability and abused their power. And they know that the U.S. is a massive, massive market of profit, of which the government benefits. I mean, many of you have probably seen that a few days ago, or maybe last week, the National Institute of Justice, a branch of the DOJ, Department of Justice, just issued a report on myths and facts on the fact that we don't need to worry about online escort agencies, that sex work is work. This is the U.S. government. And that it is a myth to believe that there is sex trafficking occurring on online escort agencies. Never mind that they are, ignoring the Mann Act, the TVPA, FOSTA stuff, which they also trash in that report. And you just think, this is a government who's supposed to protect the most vulnerable and by law target perpetrators and hold them accountable. And that's where we come in to hold them accountable to the laws that they have upheld and that they are they're throwing in the trash basically and really disrespecting and ignoring the violence and discrimination that victims and survivors of the sex trade are enduring.
I don't know if I really. So the reason why I'd asked earlier, where are you seeing? Because you're like the numbers in the massage parlors are going down, and anybody, I'm from Kentucky, right? We have Kentucky Derby. I can tell you that anytime we have any kind of big events, Super Bowl, Derby, massage places get shut down, any kind of things like that, you're going to see numbers online going up, and it's very important because we can't just, the message can't be just to shut down massage parlors, because you're not solving the problem, you're just pushing victims out in other places. So it's very important when you guys are doing these things that, we don't hear stories as women ran out the back door, because then we failed, really. I mean, I know some people may say that it's a win because that massage parlor is, but actually, so what's happening is now you're pushing victims out into other parts of trafficking they may not understand. They might be here for, like she said, being forced into working, because no one's coming here just to work in a massage parlor. That's not happening, so please be careful when you use that kind of language. I am a survivor, so that matters to me. And so just be mindful about that, you and your team. And I'm not trying to throw a dig at you at all, but if she said it, I would say the same thing to her. You know what I mean? It's very important, especially when you have survivors in spaces, to understand that, because I don't do the work that I do just to see a strip club or just to see one trafficker go to prison. I'm doing it to make sure that victim and they have the resources and the help that they need. And so if people are just running outdoors, or you're not knowing where these victims that were in this massage parlor, now you have no idea where they're at. Okay, so now, are they been moved to another state? Have they been moved online? Are they moved to another county? They're still there. They didn't just magically go away because you shut a massage parlor down.
That's a really fair point. I think we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to ask the concluding question. She had her hand up first.
So my question is, I talk about it.
That's good. Holler.
There's lots of siloed data collection within the movement.
Right.
And a lot of reticence and lack of trust among different people that collect data to share data. And I think that hampers all of us in the end. So my question is, how do we create more of a data sharing culture within the movement so that we can all help each other to move forward?
Great question. Is anybody in here familiar with the organization Stop the Traffic? Yeah, Jamie, of course you are.
Yep.
We had a call, yeah, videotape the whole thing. So Stop the Traffic is an organization that's based in the UK. They have been gathering data on trafficking from NGOs, you name it, web scraping. And they actually have a subsidiary called Traffic Analysis Hub, which is openly available to anybody who wants to have access to all of that data, because their idea is, or their, mission is that we have to share data because there are too many data silos. I don't think anything like that exists in the United States. They have very little US-based data, so I've been working with them to try to expand collecting that data and putting that in. And they're very successful. They use that data to run geo-targeted ad campaigns. Jamie developed several of them for the Avery Center in 2020, I think. Yeah, we had nothing else to do.
2020.
Yeah. And what they do with their data is they find out where people are most vulnerable, and they use geo-targeted ads to get those people to raise awareness about what they're potentially going to experience. As an example, in the Ukraine, in Ukraine when it was invaded, they had geo-targeted ads for people just so they would know their rights, just so they would know, like, hey, this might be something that is being offered to you as a job, but it's not actually a job. So that data is open to anybody. They do charge banks to use it, and organizations that can afford, so that it funds the entire operation of it, because banks have, they have to pay attention to where money laundering is happening, and so they put the cost where it needs to go, which is corporations and organizations that can afford it. So I agree that we need to do a much better job of that. And if we did a much better job of that in the US, I think, and then having also conversations between research and people who do policy work. I don't think there's enough of those conversations happening either. Shay and I were talking last night about how great it would be to have an entire event just dedicated to interdisciplinary information sharing, research presentations, alongside panels, alongside survivors, all of it. I think there's so much opportunity there, and there's my hope for the future.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Could you call me when that's all set up?
Yeah.
All of us, for that matter.
And I can say that, my co-founder, Michelle Dempsey, who's a professor, she's a law professor, but she's also a philosopher, right? She would love to have really robust data set that, interviews of individuals that is kept someplace that other researchers can then go into and I guess like double check, right? Like, is Angie's research, her interviews, and then she writes a paper based on conclusions that she's determined. Well, is there another professor, maybe in another field, not a sociologist, who then can get into those same interviews and come out with an enhancement or a different lens, and I think that gives credibility to everyone doing research if we could just open it up. I get it, we have IRB issues and,
If it's anonymized, it's not a,
Yeah,
it's not a
yeah.
problem. Yeah.
so.
Hi, my name's Kathy Torres, and I've been collecting data directly from survivors for the last 24 years. And I learned just enough about SPSS to create a database, to put it in and do analysis on it, and they're all de-identified. And now that I'm getting to the point, because I'm 69 years old, I have a lot of physical problems, but I want to give my data to somebody.
Angie wants it so bad.
She's like freaking
I will not tackle you, but I might tackle you.
And I am more than willing to give how I put my stuff in and how I do my analysis, along with my information. I got it from Sage in San Francisco, and then did some demographics and whether they were in foster care or homeless, and what are the graphics between that, and were you humiliated, were you this, were you that, along with what do you think you really need to get out and stay out. And there's overwhelmingly over time, it's been 5 things, and that's to have a job, to have a home, to have childcare, to have mental health care, support and everything. And I always forget that 5th one because I'm a little older now. But so if anybody needs that to set up to get their own data and stuff, so
That's amazing.
including potters. Including those potters that the girls, the Oriental girls. Oh, yeah, I have a lot of Asians that have come through, that was polyvictimization because it was massage and sex trafficking. And I use translators to get them to understand what their rights are here in America. You have a right to keep your visa or your passport, because they've been charged upwards of $65,000 to get it back from their family, and tell them, you have a right to talk to people.
Angie's gonna track you down.
Okay.
You're gonna be scared by the time she's done, trust me.
Yay.
I'm really grateful to everyone for all of these questions. We have 1 minute left, and I think our panelists are smart and can answer this question quickly. But I would like to know, in what area of the sex trade would you like to see more data gathered and more research conducted? And then how would this help, in your opinion, in our advocacy for policy and law reform? I'll be quick.
I think we don't do enough research in this country on labor trafficking. And I think when we're talking about illicit massage businesses, there's a, cultural competency and understanding how culture plays a role. Those individuals culturally are not gonna talk to you about sex. They're not gonna talk to you about sex crimes committed against them.
Right.
But it should be pretty easy to prove that they've been labor trafficked.
Right.
Incredibly easy. So I think there needs to be more work on that in particular. Stop focusing on the sensationalized porn,
Right.
The
Trauma
intersection
porn.
right,
Yeah.
and focus on labor trafficking, because that's also against the law.
Yep.
What, you mean instead of sex trafficking, or?
No, both.
Asian
You're not-
immigrants are not gonna talk about sex crimes committed against them if you
Oh.
need testimony, right, victim testimony, but let's go after that trafficker for labor trafficking.
Right, but then prostitution does not work, so that one really, it's different types of exploitation, labor
Yeah.
and sex, so we have to be very, very careful not conflating both.
Oh, absolutely.
But I would say, which I have to repeat, but I think it is critically important for our national institutions of research and health, including the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, our National Institutes of Health and Medical Research, to start looking at the harms of prostitution in a very meaningful way. And without that, we will never, ever be able to determine that prostitution is violence and discrimination and needs to be addressed in a comprehensive way.
I was gonna say something similar. Not as articulately, but I think we are not looking at both the crime and the harm of prostitution and sex trafficking from a national health kind of problem. I think if it could be reframed as that and measured in that kind of framework, I think the movement could potentially make more headway. I mean, if you look at like the way DV was reframed, 30 years ago, drunk driving, seat belts, smoking, like a lot of those, once they were sort of framed as a public health issue, it, I don't know, it got more traction, but I'm not the expert in that.
Thank you all. Again, you can track Andy to her table for her conversation. Thank you all. Thank you.
Good job. Shay.
Did you meet Hannah?
We've met before.
I think we met.
Yeah, we've worked on projects.
Nice to meet you. I think I met you the last time. I don't know.
Probably not.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
Okay, I need a little bit of a break for a second. It's a lot to take. Hey, gorgeous. Sorry. All right. Yes. What are we doing next?
Great, we're doing like a coffee and roundtable discussion, so grab something to drink and then try to
Okay,
find.
I'm gonna take like a 10-minute break. I need to pick up rest as well. There is coffee though? I'm gonna grab a coffee. Cool. I'm gonna grab one. What's up, everybody?
Hey, how are you?
You guys have no idea how these things are amazing, but they're a lot to take in. Hi, beautiful. Hi, gorgeous. Get me a cup so I can get me some coffee. Yeah, honey, I was like, I just think I'm gonna get me some. Yeah, I would take I like decaf. My anxiety so fluctuated after. Yeah. I read myself be 35 words. Oh, sugar. I need to fucking work. I'm taking a break. 2 seconds much.